Greetings and welcome to the Responsible AI session. Thank you for joining today. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. We are recording, so you'll receive a link to the recording so you can share that with colleagues or revisit any sessions that you'd like. And then we do plan time for Q&A at the end, so you can enter your questions at any time. And to enter a question, in case you're new to Zoom, if you just move your cursor, a little bar will pop up. There'll be a Q&A button on there. Click that, enter your questions at any time throughout the session, and we can get to them at the end, hopefully. All right, I'm Sandra Peterson, CEO of Sandstone Partners. My background is rooted in Silicon Valley, product management at Apple. I was in global marketing at NVIDIA and held several leadership roles across startups. So I naturally look at new technologies like AI through a business lens, how it creates value or not, how it scales, and how it actually gets adopted, which might be one of the hardest parts of all. I've been working in AI since 2014, and that was back when most people saw it as largely experimental. I didn't. I saw it as inevitable on the scale of the internet in the 90s. I knew that it was about to reshape every job, every function, every industry, life as we know it. Back then, there weren't really many accessible resources to engage with or learn AI, so I built one. I founded the Palo Alto Data Science Association group and grew that into a community of over 1,000 members with sponsorship from Andreessen Horowitz, Google, Facebook, LinkedIn. It was a front row seat to what was happening in AI. And that led me into my AI consulting. Among our many clients, I worked on 2 AI platforms that were ultimately acquired, including one that became part of the Salesforce Einstein engine. But fast forward to today, we have now hit a moment where everyone is using AI, but few companies are using it well. In my observations of working with clients. So there's a massive gap between that usage and people adopting it and the real impact that companies are seeing. Some organizations are underestimating the risks like data leakage and hallucinations, and other companies are overcorrecting and putting full lockdown and missing some of the opportunities that AI has to offer. And that's where I focus, is helping small and mid-sized businesses introduce AI in a way that's practical, responsible, which is the theme of today, and aligned to their goals. I am beyond thrilled with what's going on in AI today. Sarah, over to you.
All right, I am Sarah, and I am just north of Sandra. I am in the Seattle area of Washington. I recently moved back from the San Francisco Bay Area after working in various startups as their head of IT and information security. I basically live and breathe the security controls that we'll be talking today about, along with incident response, governance, and compliance. I got my start in AI by first working to transform back office processes into effortless automations with no-code tools like Zapier and Make. I transformed onboarding and offboarding, marketing creative art pipelines, finance reconciliation, and contract approval processes. When automation software giant N8N rolled out AI nodes, I dove headfirst into refactoring all of my automations to leverage the new agentic capabilities, and I haven't looked back since. When I saw the opportunity to share my learnings at greater scale, I decided to start out on my own and form Pathwarden, which brings me here in front of you today. I'm currently engaged with small to medium-sized businesses, performing ROI-driven AI readiness and technology audits, which lead to large cross-functional implementations and AI transformation initiatives that pay for themselves. If you're curious to see what that looks like in practice, I just uploaded an anonymized audit presentation demo to my LinkedIn page, which is based on a recent fintech client audit I performed. This led to a 2-year AI transformation roadmap, which is currently underway, spanning over 5 cross-functional initiatives involving 6 separate business units. All that being said, I am so excited to share what I've learned with you so far. My goal by the end of this session is to help you on your way to building a brighter future with AI, involving less manual toil and more time for inflective and strategic innovation for your company. So let's get started.
Thank you, Sarah. So today we'll dive into 5 key risks that are being experienced more and more by organizations as you increase your use of AI. We'll provide some tips for spotting those risks, which can be very tricky, and we'll close with overviews of specific risk mitigation plans for a variety of risk tolerance levels.
All right, so you may have received this via email. This QR code here leads to a pre-event survey that we did send out to all registered attendees. If you didn't receive that, you can just pull out your phone right now and scan that QR code to get access. And what that will do is it will open up a short 6-question AI risk snapshot that's going to allow you to start to think about your own company in terms of these risk tolerance levels. You do not need to understand this ahead of time to get the most out of this webinar. Every attendee will receive an Explorer Kit today, which contains basic AI literacy resources, along with an additional AI risk diagnostic, which will help you to understand where you fall along a spectrum of risk tolerance. You can then use that knowledge to help guide your company's AI readiness and transformation goals. Once you're ready to go deeper, we have designed kits for each risk tolerance level, and we would be happy to share those out with you over a discovery call or a jam session where we can start to get into your particular use cases and offer potential solutions and paths forward. So today we're going to go over 5 key risks. We have data privacy and leakage. Then we're going to move into shadow AI and transparency. Then accuracy and accountability, security vulnerabilities, and then finally bias and fairness. Now
Thank you,
over to you,
Sarah.
Sandra.
And regarding the email, I didn't get that out to folks beforehand, so my apologies. But we can include the link to the survey in the follow-up with the link to the recording. Okay. Data privacy and data leakage. These two are related, but they're not the same. Privacy is about protecting personal information that people trust you with. PII, or personally identifiable information. For example, if a salesperson uploads customer data from Salesforce into an LLM, perfectly good use for sales. They can join it with notes, prior meetings, and have a strategy for going forward with the account. That data now is at risk of being exposed outside of your company's systems. So that's an example of privacy. Leakage is about any sensitive information, PII or customer data, employee information, sensitive company documents, that ending up somewhere it was never meant to go. So how does this happen? So well-intentioned AI use can expose sensitive data through prompts, uploads, default tool settings, often without anyone even realizing it. And many of these tools have friendly default settings like improve the model for everyone. And that can make your information vulnerable. It can happen when AI stores, analyzes, or shares data and information in ways you didn't intend. And here are a couple of examples of that. Customer data pasted into prompts, like the example I just gave of a well-intentioned salesperson doing a great job prepping for their meeting. Another way is confidential files getting uploaded, spreadsheets, contracts. Great use of AI, but if you don't have the right settings and the right training, you can expose company information. Prompts. So what you put in prompts, whether it's your language and you're dictating or files you're uploading, that can be stored by the tools for a very long time. And then, of course, you need to be careful about proprietary IP exposure. So uploading things like code, roadmaps for the future plans of your company, right? Have to be careful here. All of this can roll up into governance or compliance risks. So if you have governance in place at your company, you may be inadvertently going against that governance. And if you're in a high compliance industry, you do have to be very careful about your guardrails. Okay, here's a couple of examples where this has gone awry. These are not edge cases. They're exactly how SMBs and maybe even you are using AI today. Sensitive data in your prompts. And we talked about this just now. Analysts have found that all that data that we're uploading, including things like code, payroll info, client profiles, other internal files. They did an analysis, and 20% of that was sensitive company data. This indicates real potential data leakage into AI systems. And we're not saying don't do this, but awareness and guardrails are becoming a necessity. Another example, a recruiting firm was inadvertently leaking PII, personally identifiable information. Recruiters were pasting full candidate resumes and interview notes into their AI tool, a perfectly good use of AI for efficiency, but they were unintentionally retaining that personal data outside their approved systems. And of course, this can trigger client contract and privacy concerns. So here's the tricky part. How do we spot this? Ask yourself, if you had to name the top 3 AI tools used in your company right now, could you? A lot of people can't. A top priority, and this is the first item here, a top priority should be to simply understand where AI is happening at your company. If you don't have an approved tools list, you likely have shadow AI. And Sarah will cover shadow AI in detail later, but examples of these are leakage pathways or use of personal AI tools for work, browser plugins, random agents being used by well-intentioned employees. Okay, this next one, number 2 on the list, is, from what I see, arguably the number 1 leakage pattern, which is sensitive data behaviors. This is copy pasting of customer records, contracts, spreadsheets, like the sales example I gave, HR examples that we'll go through later. All of this going into AI, which is, again, a very natural use of AI and a very efficient use of AI, but there is some risk there if you're not careful. 3, and this is a pretty easy one that you could even do something about tomorrow, is checking your settings. So confirming whether improve the model or training is on. These can be deceptively friendly. So you need to know what you're looking for and turn off training data. Also, business and enterprise versus consumer or pro or free accounts have different protective options. So know what protective options that you need for that use and set those accordingly. If you need to upgrade from free to pro, work with your company to do that so you have the right protective options available. Next up, this scanning for AI by accident in workflows. This is a tougher one to spot, but a workflow example in HR is, for example, AI scans resumes, shortlists some, then we create an interview question list and draft summaries for the hiring manager, send the email and resumes to the hiring manager for review, etc. That's a workflow. It's a series of steps that are taken, and AI is increasingly being used at various phases in those steps. What we're saying is whether it's an AI tool or even an AI feature in one of the applications in those steps, those are possible vectors for leakage. And again, not saying don't use it, but even if you only scan for the features that ingest customer data, you're setting up responsible AI awareness and behavior and actions. And then finally, finding the paper trail. This is an easy one. New AI-related subscriptions on expense reports, for example, or IT can see what new browser extensions people are adding to their browsers. Shared prompts, staff routinely using AI outputs without review steps, right? These are the paper trails that you can start spotting and getting an intuition for some of these data privacy and leakage issues. So awareness and some best practices go a long way in mitigating data privacy and leakage risks.
All right. So thank you, Sandra, for that. Definitely a huge importance to make friends with your finance department so you can check those expense reports and stay on top of company spending, which is a great segue into shadow AI and transparency. Basically, what separates shadow AI from regular AI usage is that it's invisible. So there's no way to surface the usage. We just have to look for the traces of it in things like the expense reports or in basically assets that companies submit. You can tell, oh, this must have been generated with AI. What are they using? And try to work back from that to figure out what the actual usage in the company is. So the main focus with Shadow AI here is bringing transparency to the usage of AI and making it visible to the organization. When AI tools and integrations are used without this visibility, you can't have control over the data handling that Sandra was talking about. You can't make quality decisions and you can't have a strong security posture. So it's of utmost importance. SMBs are particularly vulnerable to this because usually they're operating with small teams with huge workloads. They're trying to keep up with deadlines. The exec team might have a fear of stifling innovation, and that leads them to tolerate stealth usage. And there's often no formal training, inventory, or access controls in place for these AI applications. So the biggest move here is to start to get those in place. You want to start inventorying, training, and building those access controls out. I do want to emphasize that shadow AI is not about nefarious use. It's not implying that there are bad actors in your company. It's basically just normal employees trying to use whatever they can to get the job done as fast as possible. The biggest issue here, again, is just that it's invisible. There's no approved tools list, there's no standard settings, and there's no consistent review. Shadow AI often includes OAuth apps, browser extensions, as Sandra mentioned. It could be plugins that are part of another application that you're using, and AI features inside of those other tools. If leadership can't answer what are those tools, what's the data, and who's using them, you can't credibly manage the other risks, which are data privacy, accuracy, bias, or security. So now I'd love to talk about some examples. Shadow AI is difficult in that you never really see a headline about a shadow AI breach because shadow AI is not a discrete system that gets hacked. It's really more of a condition that precedes the event rather than the event itself. When something goes wrong, it's almost always categorized under another label. It could be data leakage, it could be OAuth abuse, misconfiguration of a security setting, insider risk, or third-party compromise. How these failures actually surface is the damage will show up downstream. So you might find that you have sensitive data that's been retained in personal AI accounts with unknown training or retention policies. You might see that there are long-lived OAuth tokens, quietly granting access long after a project ends. AI tools can be supply chain entry points if they are untracked. So it's all about getting that tracking and inventorying in place to stop this before it starts. You could also see incidents reported as credential misuse or third-party access, but it will never be labeled as shadow AI, again, because that's the precondition that precedes the actual breach event. This is more dangerous because of that. Because the AI failures are diffuse, silent, and hard to attribute in this category, there's no single breach moment that calls it out. It's more of just this gradual erosion of data boundaries and control over time. Organizations often won't find out the problem until months later, during audits or legal discovery, or after another vendor reports an incident and they go back to check how they were affected. So the key takeaway for leadership here is that the lack of headlines does not mean that this is a low risk problem. It just means that it's low visibility. Shadow AI is actually the risk layer underneath many modern breaches. And by the time it's visible externally, it's already a governance failure internally. So how do you spot something invisible? We do have this kit that we'll be talking about later that focuses specifically on shadow AI. And a lot of the action is around inventorying teams, surveying their usage. You just want to ask in a very friendly way, what tools, what tasks do you have? What data types are you trying to work with? One of the items in the kit that we'll talk about later talks about setting up an AI hub, which is a way to form conversation around AI usage. People can surface different apps that they've heard of, ask if anyone has experience with it or if they want to start using it, and we can get that conversation started so that everybody can be involved and can surface different needs that they would need to have to bring that on to the organization. Then you also just want to be inventorying everything that you're currently already using. Check all of your connected apps, review those OAuth configurations, which can be highly problematic. We'll be talking about OAuth throughout this whole webinar. And you want to make sure that you're really narrowing the scope as much as possible. A good security term to be familiar with is principle of least privilege. When you are granting this OAuth access, you want to make sure that you're only granting the access that you need to get the job done. If there are apps that are asking for overly broad scope, that's something that you should be flagging and potentially looking for an alternate vendor to use in that case. As I mentioned earlier, you really want to be best friends with your finance department. You want to have an ability to scan spend signals. You want to see expense reports looking for AI subscriptions or add-ons and trial tools. You want to be making sure that people are only spending money on the approved AI tools in your inventory list that you've hopefully done after listening to this webinar. Then you also want to be looking for browser extensions, as Sandra mentioned earlier. Those are a big culprit. And also the plugins that are within common apps like Salesforce, which have a bunch of different features and custom applications. You really want to comb through all of those and make sure that everything that you're using as a third-party vendor within that ecosystem is locked down and you're aware of exactly what permissions you're giving to it. And then finally, you want to inspect all of the AI features in all of those tools. So if you're using a CRM, a help desk, any marketing tools, these are all starting to have AI features. Pretty much every vendor at this point is working on getting some sort of new AI feature into their system to encourage people to use it. A lot of times it's being introduced before it's fully been vetted and locked down. So you want to be really careful when you turn those on. Maybe you can do like a pilot or a test process before you roll it out to the whole organization and really make sure that it's not having any behavior that you don't condone. Okay, over to Sandra.
Excellent point, Sarah. Thank you. All right, let's see. Shifting gears, AI is optimized to sound helpful and confident, but not to guarantee the truth. And this is where things like prompt engineering and sound research practices become important. AI can produce such confident, polished recommendations that are sometimes incomplete, inaccurate, and even fabricated. Those are the hallucinations that we refer to. It's really easy for early or casual AI users to put too much faith in AI output, leading them to skip verification and eventually erode their accountability. So the first area this appears, hallucinations. These are not rare edge cases, they're known behavior. And they come out of the generative models. If you've used AI regularly, you've probably started to recognize this. But if you're not sure, you've never seen it, here's a way to test it. If you upload your LinkedIn link, your most recent resume, even if it's old, and ask it to write a bio about you, it's going to make some things up to fill in some blanks. I can almost guarantee you. So that's an interesting exercise, but people need to get used to recognizing this. Secondly, unverifiable recommendations. This real risk, it isn't bad output, it's over trust. It's people assuming accuracy because it sounds right, but it's imperative to verify output that's being used at work, especially, and of course in your personal life for that matter. The next one, black box reasoning. This is a little more nebulous, if you will, but when you are relying on AI for more sophisticated projects like a strategic recommendation on entering a new market, you need to use AI to actually pressure test some of the things that you're proposing. AI is very good at telling you where your reasoning is wrong, or even asking you point counterpoint questions in a role-playing situation. Use AI so that you're not making recommendations that don't make sense or that you don't understand yourself. Over time, as we rely more on AI, get more confident, use it across the organization, it gets deeper and deeper into the organization. If best practices don't become part of the culture, judgment gets quietly outsourced. And this can happen at any level, from the C-suite to anywhere in the organization. And when or if this dynamic sets up camp in your company or in your team, don't panic. You're not alone. If you feel like it's already an issue, it can be fixed. But we simply can't skip the due diligence, and that's where this comes in. Here's some situations companies have found themselves in when they haven't done their due diligence. In one case, or actually in several, courts have increasingly sanctioned or reprimanded attorneys for submitting filings containing AI-generated fabricated citations. In this first example, 3 lawyers used AI tools to craft and submit legal briefs. Perfect and common use of AI in legal. Well, turns out AI hallucinated and included made-up case law. This was discovered, and a federal judge disqualified and sanctioned those 3 lawyers. Here's an example of black box decision. It's a harder one to kind of explain. So here's a good example of it. Air Canada's customer service chatbot that they implemented gave great confident information to a customer that was asking about bereavement fare refund policy and said that the refund was legitimate. Customer was later denied and sued Air Canada. Air Canada argued that the customer had agreed to terms and conditions, the ones that nobody reads, but everybody agrees to, and that the chatbot was a separate system. And they should refer to the agreement that everybody agreed to. Nope. Courts ruled that Air Canada was responsible for AI's output. So these are 2 examples of real-world cases that companies are experiencing now of just not having that responsible AI use as part of their organization. So how do we spot this? In general, if no one can explain a decision, no one owns the risk. The first thing to watch out for is just overconfidence. If something sounds too good to be true, maybe it needs to be probed a little. Maybe it's a new segment strategy that sounds so easy, definitive, optimistic, buttoned down, and it doesn't have the assumptions attached to it. Or like when I put out a recommendation, I always list the risks and the open items that we haven't probed yet. If that kind of due diligence isn't obvious in the output, it's just a flag, that's all. It's watching for that overconfidence to detect, okay, was AI relied on too heavily here, and should we push a little harder and ask a little deeper about this particular situation? Second, demand that explainability, right? Ask, if that red flag goes up, just start asking more questions. Ask why this recommendation, what inputs were given to the AI, what assumptions were given. You can even use AI, like I'd mentioned earlier, to pressure test some of these recommendations. Have it probe or even load it into another LLM and have another LLM poke holes in it. It'll be happy to do it, and you can set it to be as brutal as you want. Third, this is something that I've run into constantly, and I have to keep an eye on. I think the LLMs are getting better at this, but check for source drift. So I was looking for examples. I wanted things that were only 6 months old, and I was very specific about that in my prompt. But I noticed 2 or 3 of the items that came back that I really liked the examples of were much older than that. And in AI examples, something that's 2-3 years old is hardly relevant today. So in that case, my chat drifted. You have to watch out for that. So do your due diligence. And then 4 on here is identifying decision shortcuts. So take notice when AI outputs replace actions that require judgment or make decisions that affect people, money, etc. I'll give you an example. Employee reviews, second opinions, validation steps. Arguably, no one likes to do employee reviews. Some might love it. I bigger the team, the harder it gets, right? And there are AI tools and agents now that can automate this. Great use of AI. But beware when, like in the case of an employee review, it could result in a promotion or raise. Someone's livelihood is at stake. Just use extra vigilance with AI. Avoid shortcuts for important decisions. And then last point here is just clarifying ownership. If no one can explain, I think Sarah alluded to this, If no one can explain or defend the output, accountability has already slipped. And this happens in marketing content that gets out and causes PR nightmares. And people say, well, the AI made up this case and we didn't realize it. Somebody has to be accountable for the output. So many of these are awareness, behavioral, but it's also important to learn and understand the tools that are being used.
All right, bear with me here on this one. This one gets a little bit heavier on the tech side, but it is super important to talk about. And so right out the gate, I just want to explain this term attack surface, which you may or may not have heard of before. A very easy way to think about attack surface is that it's basically a place where someone can touch your system. Someone from the outside can gain access to your ecosystem. And so AI really expands that attack surface, and it expands it in a very dangerous way. Previously, to be a hacker, it required having a lot of deep tech knowledge. Usually, hackers know how to code in multiple languages and across multiple interfaces. The issue with AI is that it drastically lowers that barrier to entry for anybody who's looking to take nefarious action, because all you have to do is speak in a natural language to inject a malicious prompt and gain access to a company's resources via AI. So that's why this is such a huge deal. Not only is it vastly increasing the attack surface, but it's really lowering that barrier to entry for people who previously never thought they could be a hacker. Now they can, simply by learning how to enter a malicious prompt, or maybe they find something on the dark web, just like a simple prompt that they can just copy paste and it will have a nefarious impact. So it's very important that we start talking about how to lock this down and control for this issue. Most organizations are not consciously choosing to expose these surfaces. They're just appearing as we are adding AI, whether in the term or in the form of browser extensions or plugins within already sanctioned apps. So it requires having a lot of visibility and understanding of what we're doing as we add these features. Traditional security up to this point has assumed that apps are talking to other apps through controlled interfaces, such as we mentioned with specific coding language or specific um, data forms that are very locked down and hyper specialized. What AI is doing again is it's adding that free form language as an interface, and it's just so much easier to manipulate than these data forms. So again, OAuth is one of the biggest new risks when you are giving permission via OAuth. That gives an AI tool access to your email, your files, your CRM, or your ticket systems. It becomes a really high value pathway. And just to stop a minute and explain OAuth, it's when you are going to sign in with an app, and instead of just using a normal password, you choose to sign in with Google or sign in with Microsoft or sign in with another third party. And it often comes with a pre-populated set of scopes that it's looking to have you authorize. A lot of us, when we're moving quickly, we don't take time to look at that list of permissions. Usually they do offer the ability to uncheck some of those and restrict the scope. I highly recommend that if you are going to go with OAuth, you take care and you look at that scope and you only give access to what you're comfortable with. Alternatively, it is always my top recommendation is to either use a very complex password, which is saved in a password manager like OnePass or OnePassword or LastPass. But the best solution of all would be biometrics, because it's really hard for an attacker to copy and to use your fingerprint or your face. So biometrics first, complex password second, OAuth third if you have to. Attackers don't need to hack just the model either. It's really, you're giving them a point of entry into any point in that workflow. And then once they are in any part of that workflow or that ecosystem, all they have to do is inject those free form language instructions into content that the AI reads or processes, and they can exploit that overly broad access. I think companies have traditionally tried to just lock down the external surface, but you also have to look at the connections between apps in your automations that you're setting up and make sure that once they're in, they can't then go and exploit the other parts of that chain. An additional concern is that as you're bringing AI into your system, It's also creating equally sensitive new data stores. So it's adding audit logs, conversation history, and memory, which can contain confidential context and also be exploited. All right, so now on to some examples of security vulnerabilities that you may have heard. Back in August, attackers breached SalesLoft Drift, which was a workflow automation app integrated with Salesforce. So this is an example of one of those plugins that sits inside a much larger app ecosystem like Salesforce. They stole OAuth tokens. Again, OAuth, it's a problem. And they were able to gain legitimate access to compromised Salesforce environments. This actually happened to over 700 Salesforce environments of different customer companies, including major cybersecurity firms like Cloudflare and Zscaler. The high volume of normal-looking API calls made the breach difficult to detect for 10 days. So the attackers were in the system for over a week before it was found out. And this is even within a major cybersecurity firm that is usually very good about detecting this type of thing. Then, in September of 2025, there was an indirect prompt ejection discovered within the Microsoft ecosystem. Luckily, this was not exploited in the wild. This was something that was discovered internally, and they did manage to lock that down before it was exploited in the wild, so that's good. But basically, what happened is a zero-click style exploit, dubbed Echo Leak, was disclosed and patched in Copilot. A malicious email with hidden instructions coerced an AI agent to exfiltrate sensitive data to an attacker-controlled server, and this required no direct user interaction at all. This is something that we'll harp on a lot in this webinar. You really need to have a human in the loop at every stage because of all of these dangers that are being introduced along with all of the capabilities that AI brings. So you always want to have a human checkpoint that is checking and confirming that the use or the action is appropriate before moving it through to another system. All right. So how do we spot these security vulnerabilities? Well, we've been talking about inventories a lot. This is very important. We have a couple different inventories in our starter kits, which we'll talk about later. But really, just a simple spreadsheet is fine, and you can just start listing all of those AI tools that touch your systems, whether it's email, files, your CRM, HR, support, calendars, or any internal docs that you have. Then you want to audit the permissions that are granted. I'll refer back to that principle of least privilege again. You want to make sure you're only granting the bare minimum permissions in each case. Another thing that you want to do is you can separate out the access so no one person has all of the access. So that can be another helpful way to manage this. Once an attacker gets into a compromised account, if they're to get access to the super admin account, they get access to everything in the whole ecosystem. And that's why it's important to sort of separate out the access between people and accounts so that they can't do that. Another thing that you want to do, surprise, review your OAuth apps. You want to watch for prompt traps. So any point where you have an AI agent or an AI browser agent reading docs or reading web pages, they can place hidden instruction in there, and that can steer your outputs or actions to nefarious purposes. So you want to really limit the ability of your AI agents to go to unknown web pages and to be ingesting that content without some sort of security control on top of that. And then finally, you want to track your secrets exposure. So you need to be really adamant about keeping your API keys and your tokens out of prompts. Do not use those. You can anonymize those. You can just purely omit them, but you want to keep them out of your AI chats. You also want to make sure they're not in your logs, they're not in your support tickets, certainly not in your email, and in any other shared AI outputs. All right, back to Sandra.
Shifting gears to bias and fairness. Now, AI doesn't create the bias, it inherits it and then amplifies those patterns that are present in the training data, which is all the data out there put out by us. This is also called algorithmic bias. And the risk here increases when AI outputs are used in people impacting decisions, mostly hiring, pricing, eligibility for programs, customer support. it can appear in several places. Images that are created by AI, rankings that are put out, even language and tone that doesn't reflect your brand in some of your marketing output, even decisions that are made. They can be obvious or subtle and very difficult to detect, but it can have unrecognized discriminatory outcomes or can even result in unintended unequal treatment, which over time can subtly misrepresent your brand. It may go undetected, it may be subtle to you, but if your brand values are constantly being eroded, you're quietly eroding that trust that you're building or thinking that you're building in your brand. And at its worst, there is possible legal implications and ethical risk in this bias and fairness. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because I notice now we're running a little short on time to go through the risk mitigations, but so I'm going to pick up the speed a little bit. Here, a couple of examples that we saw, and we alluded to this earlier, which was the HR screening of candidates that were ranking candidates based on age, gender. There was one example where a tool was literally filtering out all resumes that had women that were part of a women's group or organization that they supported. They weren't even being presented to the client. Obviously, a breach. Second example here, image generators, just got to watch them. Oftentimes they can show men in dominant roles and women in more service roles. If that's your intent, if you're trying to target a certain audience, great, that's intentional, fine. Be intentional in the prompts that you give and just be aware of the output. So I think it's more important to focus on how we spot this. So reviewing people impacting use cases. So things where there's decisions like hiring, again, promotions like we talked about earlier, pricing and contracts, eligibility for programs. Things like this just have to be extra careful when you're using AI. Secondly, watching for overgeneralization. This can appear in imagery. It can appear in language that stereotypes, even in your marketing output. Anything that's simplified or just assumes traits about groups. Just be aware of that. Watch for those overgeneralizations. Testing for consistency. So running the same prompt with different either demographic signals or even on different LLMs, just see what consistency comes out of it. And you can start to detect some of this bias and fairness that might come up more in one model than another. And then checking vendor claims. Sarah mentioned this briefly, but as vendors are rolling out new features, AI features in their platforms, ask them what bias testing was done. And if they can't answer that, there's a flag there. And then, of course, requiring human oversight. I don't think we've stressed enough the human in the loop. And I even talk about sometimes human in the lead. I was at a payments and identity conference panel last week, and it was all about human in the lead instead of just human in the loop. But it depends on the use case. But having that human oversight remains absolutely critical. Okay, given time, I'm not going to go through our responsible energy use, but you will get these slides, and I will just quickly do the tips. You can use traditional search when that's good enough. You don't have to find the closest taco stand using, tokens. Right tool for the task. You'll often see now LLMs have different modes that you can choose, thinking versus instant. Choose the right mode. Don't overuse the AI, and that can help in the footprint that we're all gearing up on AI. So with that, I am going to go into risk mitigation, and I think, Sarah, if we go right to the risk postures, it might be a good use of time given we have almost just 10 minutes left.
Okay. Great. I just want to say I love that term human in the lead, and I'm absolutely going to be using that moving forward. So thank you for sharing that, Sandra. I'm just going to quickly go over some of the different risk tolerance categories that you might find yourself slotting into. Starting with on the left, we have no defined risk tolerance yet. This is our Explorer kit targets this, and it's basically trying to build AI literacy within your organization. So it's just getting the conversation started, it's getting the paint on the canvas, and it's getting some awareness focused on how do we actually want to bring AI into our organization and what makes sense for our use cases. Then we move over to the second category, which is higher risk tolerance, but we do start to see some guardrails. People in this category tend to be high tech, small teams, usually full of mostly engineers. And so in this kit and in this category, we're really focusing on technical hardening so that teams can continue to move fast with minimal friction. So getting those guardrails in place that take care of the most important things without slowing the momentum. In the middle, that's kind of our Goldilocks risk tolerance category. This one is all about shadow AI and about transparency and starting to formalize that collective conversation around AI use. We're starting to build more processes around how AI tools get accepted into the organization. And there's more process in this stage, but it's still very lightweight because these startups usually they're about 100 to 200 people. They don't have a ton of time for bureaucracy and they often don't usually have the need for heavier data controls because they're most likely not working with customer PII. They're not in finance or in health. Okay, then we're starting to get more toward the lower risk tolerance side of things with this next category. The main focus of this one is on building consistency. There's more room for that kind of process. We can slow things down a little bit and be more thoughtful. There's a lot more approvals happening at this stage. And there are rules that exist, but now they are varying by department because usually the team size is much bigger. There's more complicated cross-functional initiatives happening, and there's a big concern around safe scaling. Finally, in our last category, this is very low risk tolerance. This is where you see the most bureaucracy, you're seeing the most lockdown controls. We actually call this starter kit the Fortress, and the focus of this one is on defensibility. We're really concerned about compliance at this level and auditability. And so these are organizations that are usually working in finance or in healthcare where data needs to be really tightly controlled and usage limited. All right, so we can move into the Explorer.
The Explorer kit that you will be receiving is for companies that aren't sure what their risk profile is or they're just getting started. So I always say start small, build immediate momentum with visible progress, inspire confidence, train your team on the basics right away with practical house rules for daily use, demonstrate value to stakeholders in days, not months, in terms of starting small, and create that foundation for more advanced controls. You don't need to wait until you've got some big plan in place before you start getting your AI governance in place. So, a couple items in this kit. There's the Explorer overview, your profile basically. There's a do's and don'ts cheat sheet. Check basic AI settings. This is what we were referring to earlier, which is, are you training the models or do you have that turned off? AI output verification guide. This is where you can check for accuracy and make sure that you understand what AI is telling you, recognize anything like hallucinations, and get your content cleaned up. There's also a roadmap for doing a 3-phase lunch and learn to get started across your organization in terms of culture and awareness. And then there's a deeper do-it-yourself AI diagnostic. This is where now that you have a sense of how it's being used in your organization, what are the things that you need to ask, look for, look at, review in order to really assess what your next level of governance you need to put in place. And then there's a glossary of terms for people who are getting started. This is a basic glossary. It's not a full, complete guide to everything AI. So this Explorer kit, every one of you will be receiving.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Sandra. And then I'll just be covering the other four kits somewhat briefly, so we have some time for questions here at the end. The next kit is our Agile Innovator Kit. So this is once again, it's the high risk tolerance, small, high-tech team, usually comprised of engineers. And so what's in this kit is more of those technical hardening processes and guidelines for moving quickly, but with some controls. So first, we start with the Rapid Guardrails Playbook. This is a developer first guide to integrating safety checks like input and output filters directly into your sprints. Then we move into an AI tool hardening checklist, which is a technical lockdown list for securing API keys, system prompts, and model configurations. We go into how to manage your secrets in this one, which I think is really important for companies of this type. Then there is a red teaming light protocol, which is a 60-minute stress test framework to basically try and break your AI features before they go live. Can be super helpful just making sure that you've got everything airtight and locked down and performing the way that you want before you set it loose on the world. And then we have many versions of this acceptable use policy throughout our kits. In this one, we've got a very dev-centric AI AUP. So this is one that is very focused on the unique risks of AI-assisted coding. You might have heard the term vibe engineering. And it also helps you with managing open source model weights. It's much more technical. It's a little bit more on the shorter side because, again, we're trying to limit the bureaucracy and really focus on those technical hardening points. Then finally, we wrap the kit up with a data sanitization template. This is a ready-to-use code logic and regex for programmatically scrubbing PII before it hits an external API. And this is really a jumping off point. You might have other methods of doing your input and output sanitization, but this is just something to help get that conversation started. Then we move into Pragmatic Experimenter. I love this one. This is our Goldilocks kit. It's right in the middle of, we're not really tolerant of risk, and we don't want to just let everything go free either. It's mostly for startups that are 100 to 200 people, enough to have some processes in place, but we still want to keep it pretty lightweight because we want to allow for that exploration and innovation, which really makes these startups tick. So this one's focused mostly on shadow AI. And the goal is to build that transparency and also to create a home base for approved productivity tools. We start with that AI discovery checklist. This is a no blame audit guide to find out which AI tools your staff are already using in secret. We really want to emphasize the no blame. We just want to create a positive conversation that encourages everyone to contribute without being attacked for sharing. Then we offer an AI hub and approved tools template. This is basically a blueprint for how you might set up a central internal site where employees can go to find their vetted and green listed tools, and they can also have a conversation around which tools they'd like to bring in. It's meant to be not overly formal and really just encouraging people to contribute at this stage. Then we have a tool intake form. This is a simple gateway that teams can use to formally propose new AI tools for vetting before they start using them. And this would be very helpful for IT and for finance. You really want to start getting a stable process in place to encourage people to approach IT and finance with their requests and start getting them integrated into the ecosystem. Then we have the vetting and approval criteria. This is basically the internal logic that IT, finance, and exec team leadership would be using to decide whether or not a tool request is actually safe to approve. It's not necessarily employee facing for the whole rest of the organization, but it's for those people who are in charge of the decision making. And then finally, we wrap this kit up with pragmatic AI guidelines. This is just a simple one pager. It's a house rules cheat sheet that simplifies policy expectations for fast moving teams. Moving into the guarded scalar, this is where the organization is usually much larger. There's more cross-functional teams, there's more appetite for bureaucracy, and there's also more need. So here we're seeing a more robust AI acceptable use policy. We are seeing the need for vendor questionnaires. And so there's tier one and tier two vendors. Tier two vendors are basically vendors that don't touch any sensitive data. So these questionnaires are a little bit more lightweight but we're still trying to vet their security process and make sure that they are following the rules that we would like them to in order to partner with them. Then we're also including an impact assessment, which is a practical worksheet for evaluating the specific risks of new use cases that you want to bring into the organization. There's an AI readiness worksheet that helps you work through those use cases. It's kind of a maturity check to help you decide if a department is ready for these AI use cases and they'll be able to support the implementation. And then we wrap this kit up with a AI tool risk scorecard, which is an objective scoring system for comparing different AI tools side by side based on their safety and utility. And then finally, we move into the fortress, which this is our high stake, highly regulated environment that requires more of a zero trust approach to AI. This kit's for organizations where compliance is not just a goal, it's an actual legal necessity. So again, they're touching PII or PHI and they need to keep it locked down. So they're moving from curiosity to more of a stricter command and control approach. We start with an ownership table that clearly defines who's legally and operationally accountable for AI systems. Then we have a boundary matrix, which is a visual no-go map that tells employees exactly which data is allowed to touch what. And then we have some data classification and AI rules that partner with that boundary matrix to give granular instructions on how to handle PII and trade secrets to prevent accidental data leakage. We offer a risk register, which is a living compliance document for tracking and mitigating vulnerabilities as they are made apparent. This includes things like prompt injection or model bias. And then here we have also the Tier 1 vendor questionnaires. These are more exhaustive and they're for vetting higher risk vendors that are handling your most sensitive information. And then we wrap up this kit with our most comprehensive acceptable use policy of all. It's very formal, high governance, and it's meant to be signed by your employees to establish clear liability and standards within your organization. And that wraps up our kits.
Thank you so much, Sarah. We are short on time, and to respect folks' time, we have a couple questions. We'll take those offline with each person who's asked them individually, and you'll be receiving a link to the slides and to this recording. I'll also include the link to the survey that we started with. So thank you all for your time, and we look forward to working with you to level up your governance.
Thanks.